Have you ever felt that void when you look at someone you want and know that you have never really seen you? That silent pain that is installed in your chest when you understand that for her, you are simply invisible. You are not the first to feel it, nor will you be the last to ask you why some men seem to magnetize women while you keep waiting for an opportunity that never comes. Today I will reveal something that has remained hidden for centuries, such a powerful knowledge that the course of entire nations changed. And now you can completely transform your reality with women. If this already made you think for a second, give it like right now, because what I am going to share with you today could revolutionize your life forever. We are not talking about cheap tricks or superficial techniques. We are entering the minds of the brightest strategist in history to dig up a method that few men know and less still dare to implement. Prepare for a trip without return to the power you always deserved to have. The manuscript was there, yellowish and forgotten, when I found him in that library of Florence, among the most censored pages of Nicholas Machiavelli, not in The Prince that everyone thinks knowing, but in those fragments that history decided to bury. Fragments where the teacher of the political strategy revealed that the same power that controls empires can conquer hearts, and it is that Machiavelli understood something that most men will never understand. Female desire does not work as they have made you believe. The obsession is not born of flowers or compliments. It is born of the void, of uncertainty, from the space where she can project her deepest fantasies. The man who controls the mystery controls desire, Machiavelli wrote in those pages that almost no one has seen. And he was right. Devastating reason. Think about it for a moment. The women who have rejected you, those who put you in the dreaded friend zone, what did all your behaviors have in common? Predictability, constant availability, emotional transparency, everything that current society tells you to offer, everything that, ironically, kills the attraction from its root. The first principle of the forbidden method is simple but counterintuitive. Female attraction is born from contradiction, not coherence. When you are completely readable for a woman, when she can predict each of your movements, each of your messages, each of your reactions, the death of desire is already sentenced. The female mind yearns to decipher the indecipherable. He needs that enigma that disturbs his thoughts at midnight. I remember Miguel, a student who arrived in me desperate after having been rejected by Sophia, the woman who loved for 3 years. I have given everything, he told me, Red. My time, my attention, my complete honesty. Exactly, Miguel. You gave her everything, without leaving anything for her to discover for herself. You eliminated the mystery, and with him, you killed the desire. The first thing we did was implement what Machiavelli called the absent presence. Miguel ceased to be available 24/7. Their immediate responses began to arrive at unpredictable times. His explanations, formerly exhaustive, became partial, leaving spaces for Sophia to complete with his imagination. Her emotions, before an open book, became an encrypted manuscript that she yearned for deciphering. Love is like a mirror that reflects our own mysteries, Machiavelli wrote. When a man is completely transparent, the woman only sees through him, towards other more enigmatic horizons. This awkward truth is the foundation of the first day of the method. The void creates value. The absence generates presence in the female mind. What cannot be fully possessed is desired with greater intensity. It is the paradox that the great seducers of history have understood intuitively, from Casanova to the men who are now surrounded by beautiful women who pursue them without apparent explanation. Modern science confirms it with studies on dopamine and anticipation of reward. The female brain, evolved to detect and select the most valuable genes, responds more intensely to uncertainty than to security. The predictability biologically indicates abundance and therefore lower value. Unpredictability indicates scarcity, exclusivity, something for which it is worth fighting. Implement this first principle requires value. It requires contradicting everything they have taught you about being yourself and communicating openly. It requires accepting that, in the set of seduction, the rules are written by our deepest biology, not by our cultural aspirations. It is modern. The first task is simple but painful. You must create space where it did not exist before. If you have been constantly available, you must become intermittently absent. If you have been emotionally transparent, you must grow shade areas. If you have been orbiting around it, you must build your own solar system and let it feel the seriousness of your absence. But this seems manipulation. Miguel told me with concern. No, I replied. Manipulation implies forcing something against its nature. This is simply a line with the natural laws of female desire, laws that have existed long before us and will continue much later. The first day of the method does not seek to change who you are, but how you present yourself. Do not alter your essence, but your strategy, and the results speak for themselves. At the third week, Sophia began looking for Miguel. At the fifth week, it was she who expected her answers anxiously. In the second month, it was she who proposed to formalize a relationship. The same man, the same woman. A completely different strategy based on the prohibited wisdom of Machiavelli. Power is not to control others, he wrote, but to control the perception that others have of you. And that control begins with the mystery that cultivated deliberately on the first day of the method. The second layer of the Machiavellian method deepens a concept that modern psychologists rediscovered centuries later: cognitive dissonance. Machiavelli called him the tension of the opposites, and constitutes the second day of our method. It is the force that transforms the casual interest into an uncontrollable obsession. Imagine Laura, a beautiful woman, accustomed to men who behave predictably before her. Some are constantly flattened, others intend to impress it with achievements or possessions. All, in essence, reveal the same: their transparent desire to conquer it. This predictability creates a pattern that your mind catalogs, processes, and eventually discards. But Antonio was different. One moment he looked at her with scorching intensity. The next one treated her with cold indifference. One day he sent him a passionate message. The next one disappeared completely. When they were together, it alternated between moments of deep connection and sudden emotional distances. Without knowing, Antonio was applying the second Machiavellian principle. Who controls contrasts controls the soul. The female mind is evolutionarily designed to detect patterns and anomalies. When it finds an inconsistency that cannot be easily resolved, it is trapped in a processing loop that generates an almost addictive state. Neuroscience confirms it. Brain activity intensifies in the face of contradictory stimuli. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter of desire and anticipation, floods the system when we try to solve an emotional incongruity. The wise prince, Machiavelli wrote, he is sometimes Leon and sometimes Fox, never allowing his subjects to completely decipher his nature. Translated to the context of seduction, the man who alternates between strength and vulnerability, between attention and indifference, between heat and cold, creates an emotional addiction impossible to fully satisfy. This technique is not cruel manipulation but deep psychology. Do not create artificial contrasts, but express the different dimensions of your being at strategic moments. We all have multiple facets: the warrior and the poet, the leader and the lonely, the passionate lover and the unattainable man. The difference is that most men show only those facets that believe they will generate immediate approval. Carlos came to me after multiple failed relationships. I always fall in love more than them, he confessed. At first they seem interested, but then that interest fades. When examining their behavior, the diagnosis was clear: excessive consistency. Carlos was predictably attentive, predictably available, predictably anxious to please. It was a book whose end she could guess from the first page. We implement the second Machiavellian principle. Carlos began to show his vulnerability at unexpected moments, and then exhibit his strength when she less expected him. It alternated between deep emotional presence and sudden contemplative distance. His messages fluctuated between warm closeness and cold absence. I feel false, he told me during the first week. I explained that he was not being false but complete, showing the full range of his humanity instead of only those parts that he believed safe to show. Isn't this what women do naturally? I asked. He knew he had understood when I saw his expression of sudden realization. The result was transformative. The woman who had been losing interest gradually began to persecute him with renewed intensity. His S messages became more frequent, their deepest questions. Who are you really? He asked one night. That question reveals the success of the second principle. When a woman wants to discover you, she is already emotionally hooked. This principle has deep historical roots. The great seducers of all times, from Don Juan to Casanova, dominated the art of emotional contrasts. They were not simply bad guys or good men, but both simultaneously in unpredictable proportions that kept women in a state of perpetual fascination. The implementation requires self-awareness. You must identify your natural polarities to express them strategically. If you have been excessively complacent, you need to incorporate moments of challenge. If you have been emotionally open, you need to cultivate a certain secrecy. If you have been constantly available, you must become selectively scarce. The objective is not to create a fictitious person, but to release all the dimensions of your authentic being that you have been suppressing in a wrong attempt to please. Irony is deep. Showing less aspects of yourself, you become less attractive. By showing all your contrasts, you become magnetic. Machiavelli understood that power never resides in the predictable consistency, but in the ability to surprise, to keep others on expectant alert. "The prince who is always the same," he wrote, "he will soon discover that he is no longer a prince." Similarly, the man who is emotionally monotonous will soon discover that he is no longer desire. By the end of the second day, your goal is to have created enough cognitive dissonance so that she cannot categorize you easily. You are not the good boy or the bad boy. You are not the friend or the lover. You are an enigma that your mind is evolutionarily scheduled to solve, a cognitive addiction that keeps it awake thinking about you when you should be sleeping. And so, with the second principle, you will have gone simply interesting to become a nascent obsession. As Machiavelli said, "Men generally judge more for eyes than for intelligence because everyone can see but few understand what they see. She will see you, but it will not understand you completely. And in that space between seeing and understanding, his obsession will be born." The third day of the Machiavellian method addresses a truth that few men are prepared to accept: the power of anticipated loss. Machiavelli expressed him brutally when he wrote, "Men care more about what they might lose than they could win." This principle, applied to seduction, triggers one of the most powerful psychological mechanisms in the female mind. Think about how you feel when you have something valuable with total security, compared to how you feel when that same object could be taken at any time. Security engenders comfort. The possibility of loss generates obsessive assessment. This emotional asymmetry is recorded in our DNA as a survival mechanism, and, when activated in the romantic context, it produces extraordinary results. Alejandro came to me after years of romantic failures. He had been in a 5-year relationship with Daniela, where he was the one who loved more intensely. "I do everything for her," he told me, "but I feel that every day he values me less." The diagnosis was immediate. It had completely eliminated the element of potential loss of the emotional equation. The implementation of the third principle required complete rethinking. Alejandro needed to reintroduce the possibility of his absence in Daniela's consciousness, not through direct threats or ultimatums, tactics that only generate resistance, but through what Machiavelli called the power of subtle involvement. He began cultivating a vibrant life outside the relationship. He resumed abandoned passions, established clear limits on its time and availability. He casually mentioned new people he had met. He let certain calls go to voicemail box. It was only occasionally, without elaborate explanations. Reintroduced the mystery that years of excessive transparency had eliminated. "The fear of losing what we believe possess," Machiavelli wrote, "is more powerful than the desire to obtain what we don't have yet." This deep psychological observation manifested when Daniela, who had assumed Alejandro's presence for years, began to notice the little gaps he was creating strategically. The results were immediate and surprising. His messages became more frequent, your questions more insistent, his behavior more attentive. Without a single direct word, Alejandro had activated the mechanism of aversion to loss in Daniela's psyche. From the evolutionary perspective, this has perfo-ecto sense. Losing a valuable partner represented a significant risk for the survival and reproduction of our ancestors. Modern neuroscience confirms what Machiavelli intuited. The brain reacts with greater intensity due to the possibility of a loss than given the possibility of an equivalent gain. The amygdala, center of emotional processing, is activated more strongly in the face of potential threats than in the face of potential rewards. When a woman perceives the possibility of losing you, a neurological waterfall is triggered that dramatically intensifies her emotional interest. This principle explains why women often become obsessed with men who have left them, or with those who perceive as potentially unattainable. It is not masochism, it is pure biology. The female mind is scheduled to value more what could be escaped, which represents a challenge which is not completely assured. Rodrigo implemented this principle with Elena, a woman who had shown initial interest but gradually cooling. After several appointments where he had been completely available and transparent, he began to implement the third Machiavellian principle. He spaced his communications. He mentioned future plans that did not include it. He suggested, without explicitly declare it, that he was knowing other people. The effect was almost magical. Elena, who had taken hours to respond to her messages, began to answer instantly. Who had been postponing plans now proposed them in advance. The warm woman had become a burning persecutor. But this seems like a game, Rodrigo told me with some moral discomfort. I explained that all courtship rituals are, in essence, evolutionary games designed to evaluate the genetic and socio-economic quality of the potential companion. The only difference is that now he understood the rules instead of playing blindly. The third Machiavellian principle is not about threatening to abandon, but about reintroducing the uncertainty that every passionate relationship needs to stay alive. As Machiavelli observed, men are so simple and submit so much to the present needs that whoever cheats will always find who is deceiving. Translated into romantic context, who understands the mechanisms of desire will always find people who respond to them, not because they are manipulable, but because these mechanisms are encoded in our deepest nature. Effective implementation requires subtlety. Never directly threaten to go or end the relationship. Never use the technique as emotional blackmail. On the other hand, it simply allows you to filter the possibility that your presence in your life is not a guaranteed fact, that there are other options, other paths, other possibilities. When Daniela finally asked Alejandro if she was losing interest in her, he replied with a phrase that perfectly captures the essence of the third principle. I am not losing interest. I am only remembering who it was before meeting you. This answer, neither confirmation nor denial, kept active the uncertainty mechanism that had revived passion in its relationship. At the end of the third day of the method, you will have activated one of the most powerful psychological triggers, the aversion to loss. If you have correctly implemented the first two principles, you will be an attractive enigma. With the third principle, you will become an enigma that she fears losing. And as Machiavelli said, it is much safer to be feared than loved. In terms of romantic attraction, it is the combination of both that generates the uncontrollable obsession. The fourth day of the Machiavellian method immerses us in what the Florentine strategist called the beginning of the reverse mirror, such a powerful psychological mechanism that, once activated, turns the female mind into its own seductive. Machiavelli observed that men believe what they want to believe, and in this principle he discovered the key for a woman to convince herself of your exceptional value. The premise is simple but deep. When you create the right context, she will project her most intense fantasies and will attribute qualities that you may not even possess. It is not about deceiving, but about becoming the perfect canvas where she can paint the image of the man who has always wanted. Javier had been trying to conquer Lucia for months. Intelligent, beautiful, and sophisticated, Lucia always seemed slightly out of reach. He had tried to impress her, constantly talking about her achievements, her knowledge, her plans. I tell him everything about me, he explained to me, but I feel that he is increasing less. The diagnosis was immediate, informative supersaturation. By providing excessive details about himself, Javier had eliminated all spaces or for Lucia's imagination to work. He had closed all doors to interpretation and projection, the most powerful mechanisms of human desire. We implement the fourth Machiavellian principle. Javier began practicing what Machiavelli called the art of the incomplete statement. Instead of thoroughly explaining his thoughts and feelings, he began offering suggestive fragments, beginnings of provocative ideas, ambiguous gestures that required interpretation. People, Machiavelli wrote, they value more what should decipher than what they are given full. This deep psychological intuition was confirmed when Lucia, intrigued by the new empty spaces in Javier's communication, began to fill them with their own interpretations, invariably more favorable than any explanation that he could have offered. A concrete example. When Lucia asked him why he had canceled his weekend plans, instead of the detailed explanation he used to give, Javier simply replied, I had to solve something important from my past. This response, deliberately vague, triggered a waterfall of speculation in Lucia's mind, all configured to maximize romantic interest. Modern science confirms it. Our brain is designed to complete incomplete patterns, to seek coherence in ambiguity. When a woman receives partial information about a man who has already aroused her interest, her mind will work tirelessly to complete those gaps, invariably in a favorable way if the previous principles have been correctly implemented. This phenomenon explains why distance relationships often generate such intense emotions. Physical absence creates a space where idealization can bloom without the interruptions of daily reality. The fourth Machiavellian principle recreates this effect even in proximity. Veronica experienced this principle from the receiving side when she met Andres at a party. Unlike other men who tried to impress her with exhaustive monologues about their lives, Andres revealed information about himself in small doses, each more intriguing than the previous one. Every time we talked, Veronica confessed months later, I felt that I had discovered a new layer of him, but he also sensed many more to discover. This strategy not only maintains living interest, but makes women an active participant in the seduction process. Instead of being a passive recipient of information, it becomes an emotional researcher, constantly looking for clues, deciphering signals, completing the puzzle you have strategically created. The most fascinating thing is that, due to the confirmation bias, our tendency to interpret new information in a way that confirms our previous beliefs. Once a woman begins to see you favorably, she will even interpret your ambiguities and contradictions as signs of depth and complexity, not as defects. Fernando applied this principle with Mariana, a co-worker for whom he felt a strong attraction. Instead of the total transparency he had practiced with other women, he began to implement the reverse mirror. When she asked her about her romantic past, he responded with phrases such as, I have learned that the deepest connections are often born from the most painful scars. This answer, neither evasive nor completely revealing, created a perfect space for projection. Soon, Mariana began to attribute to Fernando qualities that he had never explicitly mentioned. You are so different from the other men, he told him one night. You have a depth that I can't find in others. The fascinating thing is that Fernando had not claimed to possess this depth. Mariana had reached that conclusion by herself, completing the spaces he had left strategically empty. The effective implementation of the fourth principle requires discipline. The temptation to explain completely, to correct favorable misunderstandings, to fill all silences is powerful. You must resist it. As Machiavelli warned, never try to force by force what can be won by patience. This does not mean lying or manufacturing a fictitious person. It simply means understanding that romantic attraction blooms in the space between the known and the unknown, in that twilight area where reality and fantasy are intertwined. Your task is not to deceive, but to create the context where female imagination can work in your favor. At the end of the fourth day, you will have established what Machiavelli called the favorable interpretation inevitabile, the mental state where she consistently interprets your actions and words in the most positive way possible. You are no longer simply communication I am with her. You have achieved that she dialogue with herself on you, invariably reaching conclusions that intensify her attraction. As Machiavelli observed, perception is more important than reality because men act based on what they believe, not what it is. In the context of seduction, this means that the image that a woman builds from you in her mind is more powerful than any reality that you can present directly. It dominates the art of suggesting, insinuating, and provoking, and she will create a version of you in her mind with which no real man could compete. The fifth day introduces us to the Machiavellian principle of the investment of power, such an counterintuitive strategy that challenges all that popular culture teaches about attraction and courtship. Machiavelli expressed it precisely when he wrote, "Appears needed help is the most elegant way to request supermation." Translated to the context of seduction, this principle reveals that strategic vulnerability may be more powerful than constant strength. Most men try to project power, competition, and self-sufficiency at all times when they court a woman. However, Machiavelli observed that this one-dimensional approach eventually generates disconnection. The fifth principle proposes something revolutionary: the vulnerability calculated as a tool of deep seduction. Ricardo had been dating Isabel for weeks, perfectly implementing the first four principles. He had generated mystery, created cognitive dissonance, activated the aversion to the loss, and established the reverse mirror. Isabel was clearly hooked, but Ricardo felt something was missing. "She is obsessed with me," he told me, "but I feel that the connection is superficial, that he has not developed that visceral attachment we are looking for." The solution was to implement the fifth Machiavellian principle. During a dinner, Ricardo shared a painful personal story, revealing an emotional wound from his past. He did not look for pity, but showing how that experience had transformed it. The crucial thing was the contrast. After weeks showing strong and unattainable, this vulnerable revelation created a devastating emotional impact. The wise prince, Machiavelli wrote, reveals selective weakness to strengthen their most important alliances. In modern psychological terms, this activates what scientists call the self-revelation effect, a phenomenon where to share personal vulnerabilities creates an instant and deep emotional connection. Neuroscience explains why this works. When a person shares something vulnerable, the mirror neurons and empathy circuits are activated in the listener's brain. Simultaneously, oxytocin is released, the hormone linked to attachment and trust. This chemical combination creates a deeper emotional connection than any demonstration of strength or value. What makes this principle particularly powerful is the contrast to the previous principles. After establishing you as a mysterious, unpredictable, and potentially unattainable man, this vulnerable revelation creates a sudden intimacy that is addictive. As a woman described, I felt that I was the only person who had seen that part of him, and I became addicted to that privilege. The implementation requires surgical precision. Vulnerability must be authentic, not manufactured. It must reveal depth, not pathological weakness. It must be presented as a selective trust, not as an emotional supplication. And crucially, it must be followed by a return to your usual strength, creating that contrast that Machiavelli considered essential for maximum emotional impact. Pedro applied this principle with Anna, a woman who had been interested but distant. After several interactions where he had maintained his mystery and strength, he chose a moment of connection to share a personal story about how his grandfather's death had affected him deeply. He did it without drama, with a controlled vulnerability that was magnetic. The effect was instantaneous. Anna, who until then had maintained a certain emotional distance, completely changed her behavior. His messages became more frequent, more personal, more emotional. He actively began moments of intimacy and connection. The invisible barrier between them had vanished. This principle explains why certain vulnerability scenes in films have so much romantic impact. The strong hero that shows selective vulnerability creates an immediate emotional connection with the protagonist and with the audience. It is a pattern so deeply rooted in our psychology that transcends cultures and times. Lorena experienced the power of this principle when Martine, who had been confident and something distant for weeks, finally shared with her her doubts about her artistic career. At that time, Lorena entrusted me later. Something changed inside me. I went from being interested to feel that I needed to protect it, be close to him, be part of his world. This psychological change is precisely what Machiavelli understood. Strategic vulnerability does not decrease power, transforms it. It goes from power based on admiration to power based on the emotional bond, much deeper and more durable. The loyalty born of admiration is fragile, Machiavelli wrote. The loyalty born of the emotional connection is unwavering. In romantic terms, a woman who admires you can leave you for someone more admirable. A woman who feels a deep emotional connection will remain even when objectively better options appear. Effective implementation requires precise timing. Vulnerability revealed too soon seems despair. Too late may seem manipulation. The ideal moment is when you have already established your value and mystery, but before the relationship solidifies in a predictable pattern. At the end of the fifth day, you will have added a completely new dimension to attraction: emotional depth. If the previous principles generated obsession based on desire and curiosity, this principle generates obsession based on connection and link. As Machiavelli pointed out, men forget the death of their father more quickly than the loss of their heritage. Translated into romantic context, a woman will forget the man more quickly than simply attracted her than to whom she formed an authentic emotional bond. This principle is not about manipulating emotions, but about allowing a genuine connection within a strategic framework. The vulnerability that you show must be real. The connection must be authentic. The only difference is that you now understand the psychological impact of this exchange, and you can implement it at the optimal time to maximize its transformative effect. The sixth and last day of the Machiavellian method confronts us with what the Florentine strategist considered the supreme principle: the transfer of power. Machiavelli described him precisely when he wrote, The most powerful act is not to conquer, but to convince the conquest that the conquest was his choice. In terms of seduction, this principle transforms obsession into complete emotional surrender. To understand this principle, we must recognize a fundamental truth. The deepest human desire is not to possess another, but to surrender completely without losing dignity in the process. The paradox that few men understand is that a woman wishes to submit emotionally, but only before someone who allows her to maintain the illusion that the final control remains yours. Gabriel had implemented the 5 previous principles with Carolina. He had created mystery, generated cognitive dissonance, activated the aversion to the loss, established the reverse mirror, and revealed strategic vulnerability. Carolina was completely obsessed, sending messages constantly, looking for her attention, demonstrating all the signs of deep emotional hitch. However, Gabriel noticed some final resistance, and last invisible barrier that prevented complete surrender. "She is obsessed with me," he told me, "but I feel he still resists surrendering completely. This resistance is natural and evolutionarily programmed. It represents the latest defense mechanism against total emotional investment in a partner who could abandon it." The implementation of the 6th principle required an apparently counterintuitive change: the gradual transfer of decision-making power. Instead of continuing to direct the dynamics, Gabriel began allowing Carolina to make small decisions in the relationship. He asked his opinion about future plans. I let it choose activities occasionally. He showed consideration for his preferences. The wise prince, Machiavelli wrote, he grants freedom in the trivial to maintain control over the essential. Translated to romantic context, you allow her to feel that she has the power of decision in everyday aspects while maintaining control of the general emotional framework of the relationship. This principle takes advantage of what modern psychologists call self-determination theory. Human beings need to feel autonomy, competition, and connection to completely surrender to an experience. By granting controlled autonomy, you satisfy this fundamental psychological need while maintaining the attraction structure you have built. The effect in Carolina was immediate and transformative. The small resistance he had maintained was completely dissolved. His messages went from looking for attention to express gratitude and devotion. His behavior became more complacent, more open, more delivered, as she herself confessed weeks then. "For the first time, I feel that I can be completely myself with someone, without fear of being judged or abandoned." This psychological change represents the success of the 6th principle, the illusion of shared control that allows total emotional surrender. The woman does not surrender despite her autonomy, but precisely because she feels that her autonomy is respected. The paradox that Machiavelli understood perfectly is that the most complete control is achieved when the other feels that he voluntarily participates in his own surrender. Diego experienced this principle from the male perspective when he implemented the method with Julia, an independent and strong woman who had resisted all her previous attempts to approach. After applying the first 5 principles and generating a clear obsession, he implemented the 6th principle, gradually making small decisions in the dynamics. "It was as if I had deactivated an alarm inside it," Diego explained to me. "Suddenly, all that fierce independence became a voluntary delivery. She kept being herself. She was still strong and independent in her life. But with me, a vulnerability that had never shown anyone was allowed." But neuroscience explains why this principle works so powerfully. When a person feels that makes autonomous decisions, brain reward circuits are activated, releasing dopamine. Simultaneously, feeling safe connection, oxytocin is released. This chemical combination creates a state of euphoria and link that is deeply addictive. Effective implementation requires constant calibration. If you grant too much autonomy too soon, decrease the mystery and tension you have built carefully. If you grant very little, keep the final resistance intact. The perfect balance implies allowing autonomy in daily decisions while firmly keeping the general emotional framework. Concrete implementation examples include: allow you to choose the restaurant but decide when they will see. Ask for your opinion about your decisions but maintain the final authority. Show consideration for your preferences while establishing clear limits on your availability and commitment. The fascinating thing about this principle is that it also works well with women of all psychological profiles. The most independent and strong women respond to him because he satisfies his need for autonomy. The most traditional respond because it satisfies their desire to feel considered and valued. The greatest power, Machiavelli wrote, he is the one who does not need to demonstrate constantly. In romantic terms, once you have correctly implemented the 6 principles, you have created a dynamic where your value and authority are so firmly established that you can afford generosity and consideration without compromising your position. On the 7th day, when the 6 principles have been implemented correctly, what Machiavelli called the complete transformation happens. The woman who was previously indifferent or slightly interested is now completely surrendered emotionally. His obsession has evolved towards a devotion that combines sexual desire, emotional connection, and unwavering loyalty. As Mariana confessed to me, referring to her experience with this method from the female side, "It is as if I had found a man who satisfies all my contradictory needs, mysterious enough to keep me intrigued, strong enough to make me feel safe, vulnerable enough to connect emotionally, and sufficiently considered to make me feel valued. I cannot imagine finding this combination in another place." This confession captures the essence of the complete method. It is not about superficial tricks or temporary manipulations, but of a fundamental restructuring of the romantic dynamics that meet the deepest psychological needs that determine female attraction and commitment. And so, when you look into their eyes and see that fire that you had never witnessed, you will know that you have crossed the threshold. This method is not magic or manipulation. It is the naked truth about the labyrinths of female desire that few men will have the value of traveling. Because each principle you have implemented is like a scalpel that cuts the superficial layers of the romantic interaction to reach the primitive nucleus where the most powerful emotional decisions live. Do you now understand why the great seducers in history seem to possess a secret knowledge? They possessed it, and now it belongs to you. But remember, who does not act with this knowledge pays the price of a life of emotional mediocrity, of warm relations, of connections that vanished as fog under the sun. The power you now have in your hands can transform your romantic reality completely, but only if you have the courage to implement it without reservations. For those who have recognized their own history in these words, who have felt that tension in the chest when discovering uncomfortable truths, leave me a signal. He comments, "Conquiso without battle." And remember, what you have learned today is just the beginning. In our next encounter, I will reveal the forbidden method that no woman can resist, regardless of how many barriers she has built around her heart.